Marcus Reynolds was driving home after a long day. The night was quiet, the roads nearly empty, and the city lights flickered in the distance. He had just finished an important meeting and was looking forward to a peaceful evening. But then, blue and red lights flashed behind him. A police car. Marcus glanced at the speedometer. He wasn't speeding. He wasn't swerving. There was no reason to stop him. But experience told him that not all stops were about traffic laws. With a deep breath, he slowed down and pulled over to the side of the road. Two officers stepped out of the patrol car. One was tall, broad-shouldered, and had a confident smirk. His badge read Jenkins. The other was shorter, stockier, with sharp eyes that scanned Marcus's car like a hunter spotting prey. His name tag read Harper. Marcus rolled down his window. "Good evening, officers. Is there a problem?" Jenkins leaned down, shining his flashlight into Marcus's face. "License and registration." Marcus kept his hands in sight and moved slowly. He had nothing to hide, but he knew sudden movements could cause trouble. He retrieved his documents and handed them over. Harper stepped closer, peering into the back seat. "Where you coming from?" "From work," Marcus replied simply. Jenkins took a long look at Marcus's ID. "This isn't your usual neighborhood, is it?" Marcus felt his stomach tighten. "I live 10 minutes from here." Harper chuckled. "That's so." He knocked on the car's frame. "Step out of the vehicle." Marcus hesitated. "May I ask why?" Jenkins's smirk faded. "I said step out of the car." Marcus knew arguing would only make things worse. He unbuckled his seatbelt and got out, standing calmly beside his car. Harper circled him like a hawk, while Jenkins checked his license again. "Hands on the car," Harper ordered. Marcus exhaled but obeyed. Why was this happening? He had done nothing wrong. Jenkins popped open the glove compartment, rummaging through Marcus's belongings. Marcus turned his head slightly. "With all due respect, officer, that's a private." "Whoa, look at this," Jenkins interrupted, pulling out a small plastic bag. Inside was white powder. Marcus's heart pounded. That wasn't his. Harper grinned. Well, what do we have here?" Marcus's voice remained calm, but firm. "That's not mine. I don't use or carry anything like that." Jenkins shook his head, acting disappointed. "That's what they all say." Harper grabbed Marcus's wrist. "You're under arrest for possession of illegal substances." Marcus knew this was bad. Very bad. But he also knew something the officers didn't. They thought he was just an ordinary man. They had no idea who he really was. Marcus stood still as Officer Harper tightened the handcuffs around his wrists. The cold metal bit into his skin, but he didn't react. He had been in tough situations before. Much tougher than this. Jenkins held up the small plastic bag with the white powder, waving it in front of Marcus like a trophy. "Looks like we got ourselves a real criminal here," he said, smirking. Marcus kept his expression calm. "That's not mine." Harper chuckled. "Of course, it's not." He patted Marcus on the shoulder. "It just magically appeared in your car, huh?" Marcus took a slow breath. He had dealt with all kinds of people before. Liars, smugglers, spies. These officers thought they were in control, but they had no idea who they were messing with. Jenkins clicked his tongue. "You should have just cooperated. Maybe we could have let you off with a warning." Marcus knew that wasn't true. From the moment they pulled him over, they had already decided what was going to happen. This wasn't about justice. It was about power. They wanted to teach him a lesson. Harper pulled out his radio. "We got a suspect in custody. Bringing him in now." The words suspect and custody made Marcus' stomach tighten. If they booked him, things could get complicated, even for him. His real job wasn't something that showed up on a normal background check. As far as the system was concerned, Marcus Reynolds barely existed. The officers led him to their squad car and pushed him inside. The door slammed shut behind him. Marcus sat still, watching as Jenkins and Harper laughed outside. They were too confident, too sure that they had complete control of the situation. They were wrong. As the car started moving, Marcus glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It wouldn't be long now. Inside the station, he would be fingerprinted, photographed, and processed. They would try to pressure him, maybe even intimidate him into confessing to something he didn't do. But that wasn't going to happen. Marcus wasn't just an ordinary citizen. He wasn't just some guy driving home from work. He was a trained CIA agent, and he had been in situations far worse than this. Jenkins glanced at him through the rearview mirror. "You know, you're being real quiet back there." "Nothing to say." Marcus met his gaze. "Just thinking." Jenkins smirked. "Thinking about what?" Marcus leaned back against the seat, looking out at the city lights. "About how fast things can change." Harper snorted. "Yeah. Well, let me tell you something. Things aren't changing for you, buddy. You're going down for this." Marcus smiled to himself. "We'll see." Because what they didn't know was that Marcus wasn't the one in trouble. They were. The police station was cold and sterile, the walls lined with flickering fluorescent lights. Marcus was led through the front door, his hands still cuffed behind his back. He could feel the eyes of the officers on him as they passed, their whispers thick with judgment. He walked in silence, his mind focused on the plan that was already in motion. Inside the processing room, Officer Jenkins shoved him into a metal chair and ordered him to sit. Marcus obeyed, his posture straight and calm. But his mind raced. This was just the first step in what would soon become a larger fight. Harper was already busy at the desk, filling out paperwork. "Name?" he asked without looking up. "Marcus Reynolds," Marcus replied. Harper wrote it down, then glanced up. "Address?" Marcus hesitated for a moment. He didn't want to give out any information that might lead them to ask more questions about his real identity. He wasn't the person they thought he was, but he knew it wouldn't matter in the long run. They didn't have the right to keep him here, but for now, he'd have to play along. "Just put down my last known address," Marcus said. Harper didn't question him further and scribbled it down. He continued with the routine questions. Date of birth, social security number. The questions felt like a blur. None of it mattered anymore. Soon enough, the officer took him to a holding cell. Marcus was shoved inside, the door slamming shut with a loud clang. The cell was small, with a thin cot and a metal toilet in the corner. It wasn't a place Marcus had ever imagined being, but he didn't let the surroundings get to him. He'd been in worse places. He had been in dangerous situations, but he had always managed to find a way out. This time would be no different. He sat on the edge of the cot and looked around. The cell was empty, except for the faint sound of a ticking clock echoing in the hallway. The minutes passed slowly, but Marcus's mind was always working. He needed a way out. Back at the desk, Officer Jenkins was finishing up the paperwork. He didn't seem to care much about the details. He was just trying to move things along, thinking that Marcus would fold under pressure. But Marcus had never been the type to give up easily. The sound of footsteps interrupted his thoughts. The door to the holding room opened, and another officer entered. He was carrying a set of keys. "Time to get you processed," the officer said, unlocking the cell door. Marcus didn't say a word. He knew what was coming next. They'd fingerprint him, take his mugshot, and maybe even ask him more questions. But Marcus wasn't worried. He knew that the truth would come out eventually. As they led him to the processing desk, Marcus glanced at the clock once more. He wouldn't be here for long. Jenkins approached him with a smile. "You've got nothing to hide, right, Reynolds?" Marcus didn't answer. He didn't need to. He knew what was coming next, and when it did, it would shake this small town to its core. As Marcus sat quietly in the holding cell, the hum of the fluorescent lights above was the only sound in the room. The officers had finished their initial paperwork and left him alone to stew in uncertainty. He couldn't help but think about how quickly things were spiraling out of control. But Marcus had been trained for moments like this. He knew he couldn't stay silent forever. In the back of his mind, he was already calculating his next moves. He wasn't just some ordinary man. He had a life far more complicated than the officers could ever imagine. Outside the small town, in an entirely different world, the CIA was already noticing Marcus's absence. At the headquarters in Langley, Virginia, Director Lawson was on the phone. It had been a few hours since Marcus's scheduled check-in, and something felt off. Director Lawson knew Marcus well. He was a reliable agent, a man of action. So when he didn't hear from him, alarm bells went off. "Where is he?" Lawson muttered to himself. He quickly picked up the phone and dialed a direct line to the local police station in the town where Marcus had been detained. He knew he had to act quickly. The phone rang once, twice, and then a voice answered. "Police station, how can I help you?" The officer on the other end sounded casual, even bored. "I'm looking for a man named Marcus Reynolds," Director Lawson said, his voice firm but polite. "He was arrested recently, and I need to know where he is." There was a pause on the other end. The officer sounded confused. "Reynolds? We don't have any Reynolds here. Are you sure you've got the right station?" Director Lawson's patience was starting to wear thin. He'd dealt with delays before, but this was different. "Listen to me," he said, his voice low and steady. "Marcus Reynolds is not just anyone. He is a CIA agent. You need to find him and release him immediately." The officer didn't seem to take him seriously. "I'm sorry, sir, but there's nothing on our records for a CIA agent named Marcus Reynolds. You must have the wrong station." Director Lawson's calm demeanor never faltered. He had a lot more leverage than the officer could possibly imagine. "I'll give you one more chance," he said slowly. "You have 30 minutes to release him. If he's not out of your custody by then, I'll be sending a team to handle this." The officer hesitated. Let me check with my superior." "Hold on a minute." Director Lawson didn't wait for a response. He knew the officer would be back in a few minutes, and it wouldn't be long before they realized just who they were dealing with. Back at the station, Officer Jenkins was taking a coffee break when the phone rang again. It was his colleague, who sounded a bit shaken. "Jenkins, you might want to hear this. There's someone on the phone claiming Reynolds is some big-shot CIA agent." Jenkins scoffed, thinking it was a prank, but something about the serious tone made him stop. Maybe he should have listened. Maybe things were about to get a whole lot more complicated than they had imagined. Officer Jenkins stared at the phone in his hand, the words still echoing in his mind. CIA agent. It didn't make sense. How could a man like Marcus Reynolds, a man they had just arrested for drug possession, be a CIA agent? The more he thought about it, the more his confidence began to waver. He hadn't expected a call from anyone important. In fact, he hadn't thought much about Marcus at all. But now, with the phone call from the director, he realized he might be in deep trouble. Jenkins slammed the phone down and turned to Officer Harper, who had been sitting quietly at the desk, staring at the paperwork. "You heard that?" Jenkins asked, his voice tense. Harper looked up, frowning. "Yeah, I heard. Some CIA guy wants Reynolds released." Jenkins ran his fingers through his hair. "This doesn't make sense. If he's really a CIA agent, we've got a problem." Harper's expression hardened. "What do you mean?" Jenkins leaned against the desk. "Think about it. What if we're being watched? What if this whole thing is bigger than we thought? I don't know who this guy is, but it's clear he's not someone to mess with." Harper didn't look convinced. "You think we should let him go? Just like that?" Jenkins hesitated. He had been around long enough to know that admitting a mistake could be dangerous, especially when there was a lot at stake. "No, we can't just let him go. We've already booked him, and the charges are on record. It'll look suspicious if we suddenly change our story." Harper thought for a moment, then nodded. "So what do we do?" Jenkins glanced toward the back office where Marcus was being held. "We cover our tracks. We make sure there's no way anyone can prove he's anything more than a regular guy. We have to make the evidence stick, no matter what. Harper's eyes widened. You mean, plant something? Jenkins's smirk returned. Exactly. We just have to make sure it looks good. If we do it right, no one will ever know the difference. The two officers exchanged a look. They knew what they were about to do was risky. But at this point, Jenkins was too far gone to back out. He needed to protect himself, even if it meant bending the truth. They went to work. Jenkins found a small plastic bag hidden in one of the evidence lockers, a piece of evidence they could use to build their case. They would plant it in Marcus's car, just like they had originally planned. Only this time, the stakes were much higher. As they went about their work, Harper glanced at Jenkins. What if he's telling the truth? Jenkins paused for a moment, considering the question. Then we'll deal with that later. Right now, we're in control. And if we cover our tracks well enough, no one will ever find out. But deep down, Jenkins couldn't shake the feeling that this was about to spiral out of control. He had no idea who Marcus Reynolds really was, and that thought made him nervous. The courtroom was filled with hushed whispers as Marcus entered. The air felt heavy, thick with tension. He walked in, dressed in a simple suit, his hands now free, though the scars from the handcuffs still lingered. His lawyer, a seasoned professional named Sandra Miles, stood beside him, offering a brief but reassuring smile. Marcus wasn't worried. He had been in worse situations that required more than just clever words. This time, however, things were different. This time, the truth would come out. The prosecution was ready. Their star witnesses, Officer Jenkins and Officer Harper, stood at the front, their faces confident, ready to testify. They had their story straight. They would claim that Marcus was a drug dealer, that they had caught him red-handed with illegal substances. Jenkins took the stand first, his voice loud and clear as he recounted the arrest. His version of events was smooth and well-practiced. He described how he had pulled over Marcus, how the drug bag had mysteriously appeared in the glove compartment, and how they had no choice but to arrest him. Mr. Reynolds was acting suspiciously, Jenkins said, trying to make his story believable. We had no reason to believe he wasn't involved in illegal activities. Marcus sat in the defendant's chair, his expression calm. He didn't flinch at Jenkins's lies. He knew what was coming. Harper took the stand next, repeating the same false claims. The two officers seemed certain of their testimony. They had rehearsed every detail, convinced that Marcus would never be able to fight back. But Marcus wasn't just anyone. He wasn't about to let them get away with it. As the prosecution finished, Sandra stood and nodded to Marcus. She knew what needed to be done. It was time to turn the tables. Your Honor, Sandra began, her voice steady and strong. We have evidence that will prove my client's innocence. Mr. Reynolds has not been involved in any criminal activities, and we intend to show the court exactly who he is. The judge raised an eyebrow. What are you implying, Ms. Miles? Sandra turned toward Marcus, who stood up slowly. He could feel the eyes of the room on him as he took a step forward. There was a quiet murmur among the audience as they wondered what was going to happen next. I'm not who they say I am, Marcus said, his voice calm but firm. I am not just a regular man. There was a moment of silence, followed by a few confused glances from the officers. But Marcus wasn't finished yet. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, official-looking badge. It gleamed under the harsh lights of the courtroom. I work for the CIA, he said simply, and I'm here to expose the truth. The room went completely still. The officers on the stand looked stunned, their confident faces suddenly dropping. They had no idea what was coming next. Sandra smiled, knowing this was just the beginning. She had prepared the court for a shocking revelation, and now Marcus's true identity would be unveiled. The truth had exploded in the courtroom, and everything was about to change. The room was silent, so still you could hear the distant shuffle of feet and the soft hum of the courtroom lights. All eyes were on Marcus as he held up the CIA badge, a symbol of his true identity. For a brief moment, everyone seemed to forget to breathe. The judge, a tall man with a square jaw, leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he took in the sight of the badge. "Mr. Reynolds," he said slowly, his voice calm but firm, is this some kind of joke?" Marcus didn't flinch. He didn't need to. "No joke, Your Honor. I am a CIA agent." The judge's eyes flickered between Marcus and his lawyer, Sandra, as if trying to figure out what kind of game they were playing. He turned to the prosecution, expecting some sort of reaction, but Jenkins and Harper were staring at the badge with wide eyes. Their confident faces from moments ago had disappeared. Sandra stepped forward, her voice cutting through the tension. "We have the paperwork to back this up, Your Honor. My client, Marcus Reynolds, has been working undercover for the CIA for several years. The arrest was a mistake, and we intend to show the court just how serious that mistake is." The defense attorney's words were clear, deliberate, and carried the weight of truth. There was no denying it now. Jenkins, who had been standing tall and proud on the witness stand just moments earlier, suddenly looked like he had seen a ghost. Harper shifted nervously, his eyes darting around the room as if looking for an escape. It was as though the walls were closing in on them. Marcus, however, remained calm. He wasn't here to fight for his own reputation. He was here to expose the truth, to let the world know what had happened. "Mr. Jenkins," Sandra began, addressing the officer with a cool smile, "I'm sure you didn't think you were dealing with someone who could uncover your lies. But you were wrong." Jenkins stiffened. He cleared his throat, trying to maintain his composure. "This doesn't change anything. The evidence we found in the car is real. We didn't plant it." Marcus shook his head. "You planted it, officer. I wasn't the first, and I won't be the last. You've framed innocent people before, and now you're caught." The words hit like a bomb. Jenkins opened his mouth to respond, but no sound came out. The courtroom was buzzing with whispers, a wave of disbelief spreading across the room. Sandra turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I ask that all charges against Mr. Reynolds be dropped. We will be submitting further evidence to prove that Officer Jenkins and Officer Harper tampered with the evidence and fabricated the entire case." The judge leaned back in his chair, clearly shaken but still composed. "We will take a short recess to review this new information. Mr. Reynolds, you will remain here while we assess the situation." As the courtroom emptied, Marcus glanced over at Jenkins and Harper. Their expressions were no longer filled with pride. Now they looked like two cornered animals. Marcus knew this wasn't just about him anymore. This was about exposing a system of corruption, and it was about to unravel. The courtroom was alive with whispers when the trial resumed after the short recess. The judge returned to the bench, his expression unreadable as he looked down at the documents before him. Marcus could feel the weight of the room's attention, but he stayed calm. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment the truth would finally come out. The officers, Jenkins and Harper, had been separated during the break, and now they were back on the stand. Their faces were no longer filled with the smug confidence they had shown earlier. Instead, there was a visible tension in the air, a nervous energy that Marcus could sense even from where he sat. "Mr. Jenkins," the judge began, his voice steady but sharp, "we've reviewed the new information presented by the defense. This includes a claim that the evidence you presented was tampered with. Do you care to respond?" Jenkins, once so sure of his position, now looked as if he were facing a storm he couldn't escape. His fingers twitched slightly as he adjusted the collar of his uniform. I don't know what you mean, Your Honor," he said, his voice faltering for the first time in the entire trial. Harper, who had been sitting quietly beside Jenkins, shifted in his seat uncomfortably. His eyes avoided meeting anyone's gaze. The judge raised an eyebrow. "You don't know what I mean. Do you care to explain the conflicting reports from your initial arrest, Officer Jenkins?" Jenkins swallowed hard. There must be some misunderstanding. He wasn't convincing anyone. The way his words stumbled over themselves was clear proof of his growing panic. Sandra stood and addressed the court. "Your Honor, we have a copy of the original report from the scene of the arrest. It shows that Officer Jenkins reported no drugs found during the search, and yet, when Mr. Reynolds was arrested, a bag of drugs suddenly appeared in the glove compartment of his car." Jenkins's face turned pale. The evidence was undeniable. Sandra continued, "We also have statements from several witnesses who were at the scene. They can confirm that no drugs were present in Mr. Reynolds' car at the time of the stop. Officer Jenkins, your story is falling apart." The courtroom grew even quieter. Jenkins's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. His mind was racing, his thoughts tumbling like stones down a hill. It was as though he was trying to find a way out, but there was no escape. Harper, who had been sitting quietly, suddenly shifted in his seat and cleared his throat. I didn't know," he muttered. "I didn't know it would go this far. I thought we could just handle it." The room was silent for a moment as Harper's admission echoed in the air. He had cracked. The pressure had become too much for him to bear. The weight of his own guilt was too heavy. Jenkins shot him a furious look, but Harper wouldn't look back. The truth had come spilling out, and there was no putting it back in. "I didn't know," Harper repeated, his voice barely a whisper. "I didn't want to be part of it, but I was." The judge nodded slowly, as if processing everything he had just heard. "I believe we have enough here to proceed." Sandra smiled at Marcus, who remained composed, but a small sense of relief washed over him. The officer's lies were finally unraveling. It was over. The truth had won. The courtroom was still, a heavy silence filling the air as the judge took in all the evidence that had been presented. Jenkins and Harper were no longer the confident officers they had once been. Now they were just two men caught in the web of their own lies. Marcus could see it in their faces, the realization that they were losing everything. After a long pause, the judge finally spoke. "Based on the new evidence and the testimonies provided by both the defense and the witnesses, the court finds that the charges against Mr. Marcus Reynolds were fabricated. The officers involved in this case, Jenkins and Harper, are hereby under investigation for misconduct, evidence tampering, and abuse of power." A murmur spread through the courtroom as people began to realize the full extent of what had just been uncovered. For a moment, it felt as if time had stopped. But for Marcus, it felt like a victory. Not just for himself, but for the countless others who had been wronged by the same system. Jenkins's face turned bright red, his eyes wide with disbelief. "This can't be happening," he muttered under his breath. Harper sat motionless, his hands trembling on the edge of the stand. He had broken. The weight of his own guilt was too much for him to bear, and he couldn't even bring himself to look at the judge or the people in the courtroom. The judge continued, his voice steady and commanding. "Officer Jenkins, Officer Harper, you are both suspended from duty pending further investigation. You will be placed under formal review, and your actions will be scrutinized thoroughly. This court will not tolerate such behavior." Sandra turned to Marcus, offering him a small but proud smile. He had been right to stay calm, right to trust that the truth would come out. And now, the officers who had tried to ruin his life were facing the consequences of their actions. Marcus stood up, his shoulders straight and his expression calm. "Thank you, Your Honor," he said, his voice clear and strong. He had done what he needed to do, not for himself, but for justice. As he walked out of the courtroom, the sound of people whispering filled the air. The crowd was stunned, some in disbelief, others in admiration. The word had spread quickly. Marcus Reynolds was not just a regular man. He was a hero. Outside, reporters gathered, eager to hear from him. "Mr. Reynolds," one of them asked, "how do you feel about the outcome of the trial?" Marcus paused for a moment, looking around at the faces of the people who had witnessed the truth unfold. "It's not just about me," he said quietly. "It's about everyone who has been wronged, who has been overlooked. Justice matters, and today it was served." As the reporters continued to ask questions, Marcus simply smiled. He knew this wasn't the end. There was still much to be done. But for now, he could walk away knowing that the truth had won. Justice had been served, and for the first time in a long while, Marcus felt the weight of the world lift from his shoulders.